By all outward appearances, John Wayne Gacy was the perfect neighbor. He was a devoted husband, a businessman who knew how to hustle, a man who waved from his front lawn and shook hands at community meetings. He volunteered for the Democratic Party, he hosted block parties, he even dressed up as a clown, bringing balloons, painted smiles, and laughter to children's birthdays. But behind that mask of normalcy, something far more sinister was festering. While Gacy was hosting barbecues in his backyard, the crawl space beneath his house was filling with bodies. Victims stacked in shallow graves just inches below the floorboards where his family ate dinner and his guests laughed over beer. This is the horror of John Wayne Gacy, the ordinary man who lived an extraordinary lie. A man who played the role of upstanding citizen by day, while by night became something else entirely, something monstrous. This is Crime Stands Still, and I'm your host, Carrie Drobin. Before I begin, I have a favor to ask. If you like my podcast, let me know by hitting that subscribe button. It helps me bring you more stories like this. And if you're interested in knowing more about people like Gacy, their pathology, their psychopathy, check out my new book, Surviving a Psychopath, available on Amazon and anywhere where books are sold. And a disclaimer. The story of John Wayne Gacy's crimes and discovery are graphic and brutal. Listener and viewer discretion is advised. Psychiatrists who examined John Wayne Gacy later described him in chillingly simple terms: a psychopath. Lacking empathy, manipulative, remorseless, fully aware of every action, every decision, every lie. And yet, when confronted with the evidence of his crimes, Gacy's words were almost casual. "I never killed anyone," he insisted. Instead, he claimed the young men had died accidentally. "Sex play gone wrong," he said. His attorney offered an insanity defense based on a compulsion to kill, a, quote, irresistible impulse. And thanks to alcohol, Gacy had either blacked out or lost his inhibitions. In short, he'd been unable to control himself. The jury rejected the defense, largely because the prosecutor was able to show that Gacy had planned several of the murders, and his team's psychologists insisted that an irresistible impulse cannot be planned in advance. It does not jive with premeditation. With Gacy, each professional involved ran a standard battery of assessment instruments, such as an IQ test, projective tests, and a self-report inventory. Some of them also examined him for potential brain damage and found none. Each then determined a diagnosis from the results and lined up either for or against the claim that Gacy did not know what he was doing each time he murdered 33 young men. Prosecutor William Kunkel Jr. was able to show that Gacy had planned several of the murders, and one of the team psychologists stated that one couldn't plan an irresistible impulse and also methodically plot a murder. Gacy also had exhibited a sufficiently good memory for the crimes and where he'd placed victims' bodies, such that his claim of blacking out seemed preposterous. The jury thought so too. They convicted him of serial rape and murder for 33 victims, and he was sentenced to death in March of 1980. Before his execution, Gacy was on the phone with his friend Craig Bowley. Yeah, I know, it's so hard to imagine that he had friends still. But he nonchalantly said to his friend, "Okay, my ride is here, gotta go," referencing his transport to his execution. He was unremorseful to the end, and Gacy's final words before being stabbed by that needle on May 10, 1994, were, "Kiss my ass." The injection malfunctioned. He wasn't pronounced dead for 18 minutes. One investigator who witnessed it said that Gacy probably felt more pain than any of his victims, though he did have a much easier death. In my opinion, he got a much easier path than he deserved. One interviewer said, as far as the death penalty goes, if they're going to have a death penalty case and he didn't get it, then they shouldn't have the death penalty at all. In other words, the death penalty was made for people like Gacy. Raphael Tovar, a retired police officer who assisted during the exhumation of the bodies, called the execution closure. He said it was proof that the investigators had done their job. But is it really closure? I mean, is that even possible for victims of Gacy or anybody who has somebody that's got a person who's been murdered? I mean, Gacy waited years on death row. Remember, I said he was sentenced in 1980. And he was put to death in 1994. So that's years lingering on death row while appeals are being taken. During that time, just to add insult to injury, here's a little interesting fact, he became a prolific artist. His clown paintings are highly desired by so-called murderabilia collectors. And his individual works command prices as high as $25,000 each at art auctions. Now, there should be some kind of prohibition on this. I mean, there is with killers who want to write their stories. You know, there's the Son of Sam laws, which I think actually were repealed. But then, just to add to that, okay, so not only is he on death row and becoming creative on death row and waiting as all of his appeals go through their process and everybody knows that he's just guilty as hell, but he still has a legal right to appeal, right? I mean, I used to be a capital lawyer, so I know the routine. I mean, I was a capital lawyer for 15 years, and I had one of my clients during that time period wind up being executed. And it took, over 15 years, because by the time I got the case, he had already been, sentenced to death for years, because I got him on post-conviction. But just to prove a point, it just takes that long. They're just there. They get to live a life that, their victims didn't live. So, anyway, did I say I was a former capital lawyer? So then there's the infamous last meal. So I know for me, this was a really interesting sort of research project, not only what people order, but why they have a last meal. Why feed somebody that you're about to murder or kill, right? Well, just for the record, Gacy asked for fried food. 12 fried shrimp, to be exact. A bucket of KFC chicken with French fries and a pound of strawberries. There have been a lot of really weird last meals. I think Eileen Wuornos, who's one of the few female serial killers out there, just ordered coffee. And it's sort of like I think there have been a lot of theories on this, but the tradition has some ancient superstitious roots. Ghosts, for one, right? There's this idea that requiring a Last Supper will ensure a peaceful passage to the afterlife, as well as a desire to acknowledge the condemned person's humanity by offering a final choice-driven meal, right? It serves to reduce, maybe, guilt for the executioner. So it's kind of a way to acknowledge this sort of shared human experience of death. At least that's the way it's been described to me. What do you think? I mean, do we honestly care about a death row inmate's humanity? Did Gacy even have humanity? I mean, I would argue no. I would argue that we shouldn't care. But, I might be in the minority there. I'm interested to know what you guys think. But anyway, I thought you might find that interesting. It's just a little tidbit on sort of the postscript of John Wayne Gacy and why there's so much attention put on his case. And I think really and truly the reason there's been so much done is because he left this sort of extraordinary evidence trove. Not only did he enjoy the gamesmanship of having people, not suspect him, then suspect him, and, leading this sort of double life. It was like a cat and mouse chase for years until he's finally, arrested and indicted and he's waiting to be tried. And then he just delivers this sort of like incredible amount of evidence, the tapes, the confession tapes. You can listen to, I think a lot of them, actually maybe all of them are listed in a podcast called Defense Diaries. And it's pretty fascinating to hear how he really exhibits pretty much the hallmarks of psychopathy. The biggest of which is he just deflects accountability. I mean, you can hear him say in the span of, 5 minutes, he will, accept responsibility. He'll say, yeah, I confess I did it. And then in the next breath, he says his alter ego did it. And then in the next breath, he blames his, employees at PDM for doing it. And then he completely deflects and says, no, I didn't do it. Gaslighting, like, I don't know what you're talking about. I never said I did it. So you can see that sort of, transformation or transition, I guess, not really transformation, but transition, where he takes these interviewers on this sort of cat and mouse game, like he's enjoying every minute of it, because that really is at the heart and soul of a psychopath. They love the game. They love the performance. And so for him, I mean, he's literally got a spotlight on his life, his, quote unquote legacy, as he calls it, and it's fascinating from that perspective, but it's also sort of a cautionary tale. Like, all of these people were duped by him because he was such a masterful manipulator. He was able to create this facade and this persona that fooled everyone for such a long time. And I think that's one of the reasons why his case is so important, why we need to come back to it, why we need to do podcasts like this, because I think the more people are aware of this kind of pathology, the less they're going to be duped by that. I mean, Gacy, unfortunately, was allowed to kill for years, 33 victims that we know of. And what a shame, from a conflation of issues that came up, not the least of which was the prosecutor, deciding finally to charge the crimes. But, at each step of the way, you can sort of see how things were bungled, how things fell through the cracks, how Gacy got away with it, and how ultimately, the final arbiter of what they're going to charge him with has to make sure that the evidence they have against Gacy is lock solid, airtight. They don't want to lose a case like this. So I think, having been from both perspectives, I mean, I was a former prosecutor and a former capital defense attorney, and I can see this from both sides. It's such an interesting, just from an intellectual viewpoint, it's such an interesting case to follow, because we can learn so much from it. If we can manage to compartmentalize, I guess. We can't really absorb or digest the kinds of brutality that Gacy was involved in, but if we can compartmentalize it so that we can learn from it, then I think it's a teaching moment, and I think it's something that we can take away and keep coming back to. So it's, and it's one of the reasons that I do podcasts like this, not to sensationalize these crimes, not to put more of a spotlight and a focus on such a monster, but to be, ethically responsible about it. Because at the end of the day, the reason that I devote my time to this, the reason that I research this, is so that I can inform, so that I can educate, that I can, shine light on a gap, because we have to be able to avoid this moving forward. And it's why I wrote a book on surviving a psychopath, because I mean, we can all be manipulated by somebody like Gacy. We can all fall into that trap. We can all want to believe and want to have that human connection. I mean, that's what psychopaths prey on. It's that need to be accepted, like whatever vulnerability you possess, however you show up in the world, is potentially, material for a predator. And so I think the more we talk about it, the more we share it, the more we understand it, the less apt we are to become that next victim. Thanks for listening. If you liked what you heard, please like, share, and subscribe my podcast. It helps me bring you more. And until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and stay tuned.